My mother looked me dead in the eye and banned my 5-year-old daughter from her milestone birthday party. She claimed my child was simply too wild and would ruin the expensive professional photography she had booked. Yet in the exact same breath, she slid a $25,000 invoice across the table, fully expecting me to fund the entire extravagant affair. So I did something she never could have anticipated. I took care of the bill, but I also bought the very ground she planned to stand on. By the end of that week, my parents and my golden child sister went completely pale. I am Jada, 33 years old, and as a managing director at a private equity firm, I know a bad investment when I see one. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who only valued you for what you could provide. The air inside the elite bridal and evening wear boutique smelled like expensive vanilla candles and sheer entitlement. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, my feet aching in my heels after a grueling 6-hour board meeting negotiating a corporate merger. My left hand gripped my briefcase while my right hand firmly held the small, warm hand of my 5-year-old daughter, Zuri. Zuri was a bright, joyful, and spirited little girl who had recently been diagnosed with mild ADHD. To me, she was absolute perfection. To my mother, Brenda, she was a walking liability who refused to act like a silent aesthetic prop. We walked toward the back of the showroom, where my mother was currently standing on a circular velvet pedestal. She was being fitted for a custom gown, dripping in silver beadwork, preparing for her highly anticipated 60th Diamond Gala. Sitting on a plush ivory sofa nearby was my older sister Chantel and her white husband Preston. They were leisurely sipping complimentary champagne from crystal flutes, looking entirely too relaxed for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Chantel was the undeniable golden child of our family. Vain, superficial, and constantly thriving on patronizing me, she had built her entire identity around being the perfect daughter who married well. Preston, on the other hand, was a different breed of exhausting. He worked in what he vaguely referred to as finance, though everyone knew he mostly just spent his family's dwindling generational wealth while making microaggressive remarks about my life as a single mother. The working mother arrives, Preston drawled as we approached the seating area. He swirled the champagne in his glass, looking me up and down in my tailored business suit. I do not know how you manage it, Jada. Raising a child all by yourself while trying to keep up in the corporate world. It must be so draining not having a partner to shoulder the burden. I forced my jaw to unclamp, swallowing the sharp retort that rested on my tongue. I manage just fine, Preston. Some of us actually have to work for our capital instead of waiting for a trust fund distribution. Before Preston could respond to the slight, Zuri pulled her hand from mine. She had spotted a display of sparkling tiaras on a nearby glass table and wandered over, her eyes wide with childlike wonder. Zuri, baby, do not touch those, I warned, stepping toward her quickly. But it was too late. As she turned around, her small shoulder bumped against a headless mannequin draped in a heavy silk gown. The mannequin wobbled precariously on its metal stand. It did not fall, and absolutely nothing was broken. But the sudden movement caused the heavy base to scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. Brenda gasped from her pedestal, clutching her beaded bodice, as if she had just witnessed a violent crime. Good heavens, control your child! She snapped, her voice echoing sharply through the quiet boutique. I quickly pulled Zuri back to my side, smoothing her curly hair to comfort her. She just bumped it, Mom. Nothing is broken. My mother stepped down from the pedestal, shooing away the terrified seamstress who was pinning her hem. She marched over to me, her face pulled into a tight, furious scowl. This is exactly what I am talking about, Jada. The child is entirely too much. She has no discipline. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Leave the kid at home next week. She is banned from the gala. I stared at my mother, completely stunned by the sheer cruelty of her words. You are banning your own granddaughter from your 60th birthday party because she bumped a mannequin. She is too wild, Brenda insisted, waving her hand dismissively in the air. I have hired a premier photographer from Atlanta. This gala is going to be featured in a local society magazine. I will not have her running around knocking over centerpieces and ruining the professional photography. I need a flawless evening, and Zuri is simply not capable of behaving. Chantel chimed in from the sofa, setting her champagne flute down with a delicate clink. Mom is right, Jada. You know you have a habit of ruining the aesthetic of important family events. Just look at what you did at my baby shower 2 years ago. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in my chest, mixed with a deep historical exhaustion. I did not ruin your baby shower, Chantel. I replied, my voice dangerously low. I just refused to chemically straighten my hair for your photos. Mom explicitly told you the dress code was sleek and elegant, Chantel countered smoothly, adjusting her posture. And you showed up with your natural hair looking like a complete distraction. We are just asking you to be considerate of Mom's special day. A child running around having a meltdown is not part of the vision. The sheer audacity of my sister defending the exclusion of my child while criticizing my natural hair was suffocating. I had spent my entire life as a black woman fighting to be respected in male-dominated boardrooms, only to come back to my own family and be treated like a second-class citizen. I gripped Zuri's hand tighter, preparing to turn around and walk out of their toxic lives completely. But before I could take a single step toward the door, my mother reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a sleek, heavy cardstock envelope and slid it across the glass display table toward me. Anyway, Brenda said, her tone instantly shifting from harsh criticism to casual expectation. I need you to handle this today. The final balances are due. I looked down at the envelope, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. What is this? It is the invoice for the venue and the catering, she said plainly. $25,000. You need to wire the money by tomorrow morning or they will cancel our reservation. I stared at her, genuinely trying to process the magnitude of her delusion. You just banned my child from your party, and in the very next breath you are asking me to pay $25,000 to fund it. Preston chuckled from the couch, leaning forward to adjust his expensive watch. Come on, Jada. Be a team player. You know my capital is tied up in a new hedge fund right now. Chantel and I cannot liquidate our assets for a party. Be a good daughter and handle this for your mother. You make more than enough at that equity firm of yours. The room seemed to freeze. I looked at Preston, smug and secure in his unearned confidence. I looked at Chantel, who was already inspecting her manicured nails, completely unbothered by the cruelty of banning her own niece. And finally, I looked at my mother, a woman who valued the appearance of a wealthy, perfect family, so much that she was willing to extract the actual wealth from her single daughter to maintain the illusion. I opened the envelope. The heavy ivory paper detailed the astronomical costs for food staffing and exclusive access to the property. But my eyes immediately locked onto the bold lettering at the top of the invoice. The venue was called the Sterling Estate. It was a highly sought-after historical property on the outskirts of the city. As a managing director in private equity tracking, commercial real estate and distressed hospitality assets was literally my job. And I happened to know exactly who owned the Sterling Estate. More importantly, I knew the immense financial trouble that ownership group was currently facing. A strange, absolute calm washed over me. The anger that had been bubbling in my chest instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They wanted me to fund their perfect picture. They wanted me to pay for the stage where they would perform their superiority, all while keeping my beautiful, spirited daughter hidden away like a shameful secret in the dark. I looked up from the invoice. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the paper back in her face. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, dead smile that did not reach my eyes, but my mother was too self-absorbed to notice the difference. I will take care of it, Mom, I said softly. I slipped the invoice into my briefcase. Brenda clapped her hands together, immediately turning back toward the fitting pedestal. Wonderful. Make sure the wire clears by 9 in the morning. I am not dealing with any late fees. I did not say goodbye to Chantel or Preston. I simply squeezed Zuri's hand and walked out of the vanilla-scented boutique and into the warm afternoon air. As soon as the heavy glass doors closed behind us, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. David speaking. David, I said, my voice entirely steady. It is Jada. I need you to pull the financial profiles on the parent company that holds the deed to the Sterling estate. I know they defaulted on their primary loan last quarter. I want to buy the debt. I want the deed. And I want the entire transaction closed and executed by Friday afternoon. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. That is an aggressive timeline, Jada. But the sellers are distressed. We can likely force a hostile takeover if you are willing to leverage the capital. Do it, I commanded. Whatever it takes. I ended the call and looked down at Zuri, who was happily watching a butterfly flutter past the sidewalk. My family wanted to treat me like an open checkbook, while treating my daughter like an embarrassment. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you hand the keys to your kingdom over to the family scapegoat. My mother looked me dead in the eye and banned my 5-year-old daughter from her milestone birthday party. She claimed my child was simply too wild and would ruin the expensive professional photography she had booked. Yet in the exact same breath, she slid a $25,000 invoice across the table, fully expecting me to fund the entire extravagant affair. So I did something she never could have anticipated. I took care of the bill, but I also bought the very ground she planned to stand on. By the end of that week, my parents and my golden child sister went completely pale. I am Jada, 33 years old, and as a managing director at a private equity firm, I know a bad investment when I see one. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who only valued you for what you could provide. The air inside the elite bridal and evening wear boutique smelled like expensive vanilla candles and sheer entitlement. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, my feet aching in my heels after a grueling 6-hour board meeting, negotiating a corporate merger. My left hand gripped my briefcase while my right hand firmly held the small, warm hand of my 5-year-old daughter, Zuri. Zuri was a bright, joyful, and spirited little girl who had recently been diagnosed with mild ADHD. To me, she was absolute perfection. To my mother, Brenda, she was a walking liability who refused to act like a silent aesthetic prop. We walked toward the back of the showroom where my mother was currently standing on a circular velvet pedestal. She was being fitted for a custom gown, dripping in silver beadwork, preparing for her highly anticipated 60th Diamond Gala. Sitting on a plush ivory sofa nearby was my older sister Chantel and her white husband Preston. They were leisurely sipping complimentary champagne from crystal flutes, looking entirely too relaxed for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Chantel was the undeniable golden child of our family. Vain, superficial, and constantly thriving on patronizing me. She had built her entire identity around being the perfect daughter who married well. Preston, on the other hand, was a different breed of exhausting. He worked in what he vaguely referred to as finance. Though everyone knew he mostly just spent his family's dwindling generational wealth while making microaggressive remarks about my life as a single mother. "Ah, the working mother arrives," Preston drawled as we approached the seating area. He swirled the champagne in his glass, looking me up and down in my tailored business suit. "I do not know how you manage it, Jada. Raising a child all by yourself while trying to keep up in the corporate world. It must be so draining not having a partner to shoulder the burden." I forced my jaw to unclamp, swallowing the sharp retort that rested on my tongue. "I manage just fine, Preston. Some of us actually have to work for our capital instead of waiting for a trust fund distribution." Before Preston could respond to the slight, Zuri pulled her hand from mine. She had spotted a display of sparkling tiaras on a nearby glass table and wandered over, her eyes wide with childlike wonder. "Zuri, baby, do not touch those," I warned, stepping toward her quickly. But it was too late. As she turned around, her small shoulder bumped against a headless mannequin draped in a heavy silk gown. The mannequin wobbled precariously on its metal stand. It did not fall, and absolutely nothing was broken. But the sudden movement caused the heavy base to scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. Brenda gasped from her pedestal, clutching her beaded bodice, as if she had just witnessed a violent crime. "Good heavens, control your child!" She snapped, her voice echoing sharply through the quiet boutique. I quickly pulled Zuri back to my side, smoothing her curly hair to comfort her. "She just bumped it, Mom. Nothing is broken." My mother stepped down from the pedestal, shooing away the terrified seamstress who was pinning her hem. She marched over to me, her face pulled into a tight, furious scowl. This is exactly what I am talking about, Jada. The child is entirely too much. She has no discipline. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Leave the kid at home next week. She is banned from the gala. I stared at my mother, completely stunned by the sheer cruelty of her words. You are banning your own granddaughter from your 60th birthday party because she bumped a mannequin. She is too wild, Brenda insisted, waving her hand dismissively in the air. I have hired a premier photographer from Atlanta. This gala is going to be featured in a local society magazine. I will not have her running around knocking over centerpieces and ruining the professional photography. I need a flawless evening, and Zuri is simply not capable of behaving. Chantel chimed in from the sofa, setting her champagne flute down with a delicate clink. Mom is right, Jada. You know you have a habit of ruining the aesthetic of important family events. Just look at what you did at my baby shower 2 years ago. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in my chest, mixed with a deep historical exhaustion. I did not ruin your baby shower, Chantel, I replied, my voice dangerously low. I just refused to chemically straighten my hair for your photos. Mom explicitly told you the dress code was sleek and elegant, Chantel countered smoothly, adjusting her posture. And you showed up with your natural hair looking like a complete distraction. We are just asking you to be considerate of Mom's special day. A child running around having a meltdown is not part of the vision. The sheer audacity of my sister defending the exclusion of my child while criticizing my natural hair was suffocating. I had spent my entire life as a black woman, fighting to be respected in male-dominated boardrooms, only to come back to my own family and be treated like a second-class citizen. I gripped Zuri's hand tighter, preparing to turn around and walk out of their toxic lives completely. But before I could take a single step toward the door, my mother reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a sleek, heavy cardstock envelope and slid it across the glass display table toward me. Anyway, Brenda said, her tone instantly shifting from harsh criticism to casual expectation. I need you to handle this today. The final balances are due. I looked down at the envelope, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. What is this? It is the invoice for the venue and the catering, she said plainly. $25,000. You need to wire the money by tomorrow morning, or they will cancel our reservation. I stared at her, genuinely trying to process the magnitude of her delusion. You just banned my child from your party, and in the very next breath you are asking me to pay $25,000 to fund it. Preston chuckled from the couch, leaning forward to adjust his expensive watch. Come on, Jada. Be a team player. You know my capital is tied up in a new hedge fund right now. Chantel and I cannot liquidate our assets for a party. Be a good daughter and handle this for your mother. You make more than enough at that equity firm of yours. The room seemed to freeze. I looked at Preston, smug and secure in his unearned confidence. I looked at Chantel, who was already inspecting her manicured nails, completely unbothered by the cruelty of banning her own niece. And finally, I looked at my mother. A woman who valued the appearance of a wealthy, perfect family, so much that she was willing to extract the actual wealth from her single daughter to maintain the illusion. I opened the envelope. The heavy ivory paper detailed the astronomical costs for food staffing and exclusive access to the property. But my eyes immediately locked onto the bold lettering at the top of the invoice. The venue was called the Sterling Estate. It was a highly sought-after historical property on the outskirts of the city. As a managing director in private equity, tracking commercial real estate and distressed hospitality assets was literally my job. And I happened to know exactly who owned the Sterling Estate. More importantly, I knew the immense financial trouble that ownership group was currently facing. A strange, absolute calm washed over me. The anger that had been bubbling in my chest instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They wanted me to fund their perfect picture. They wanted me to pay for the stage where they would perform their superiority, all while keeping my beautiful, spirited daughter hidden away like a shameful secret in the dark. I looked up from the invoice. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the paper back in her face. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, dead smile that did not reach my eyes, but my mother was too self-absorbed to notice the difference. I will take care of it, Mom, I said softly. I slipped the invoice into my briefcase. Brenda clapped her hands together, immediately turning back toward the fitting pedestal. Wonderful. Make sure the wire clears by 9 in the morning. I am not dealing with any late fees. I did not say goodbye to Chantel or Preston. I simply squeezed Zuri's hand and walked out of the vanilla-scented boutique and into the warm afternoon air. As soon as the heavy glass doors closed behind us, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. David speaking. David, I said, my voice entirely steady. It is Jada. I need you to pull the financial profiles on the parent company that holds the deed to the Sterling estate. I know they defaulted on their primary loan last quarter. I want to buy the debt. I want the deed. And I want the entire transaction closed and executed by Friday afternoon. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. That is an aggressive timeline, Jada. But the sellers are distressed. We can likely force a hostile takeover if you are willing to leverage the capital. Do it, I commanded. Whatever it takes. I ended the call and looked down at Zuri, who was happily watching a butterfly flutter past the sidewalk. My family wanted to treat me like an open checkbook while treating my daughter like an embarrassment. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you hand the keys to your kingdom over to the family scapegoat. Sunday dinner at my parents' house was always less of a family gathering and more of a highly choreographed theatrical performance. 3 days after the bridal boutique incident, I pulled my car into the winding circular driveway of their sprawling brick estate. The house was a monument to their obsession with status, boasting perfectly manicured hedges and a pair of stone lions guarding the entrance. I had left Zuri at home with my trusted nanny, Mrs. Higgins. I needed a completely clear head to assess the battlefield, and I absolutely refused to subject my daughter to another afternoon of being treated like an unwanted guest by her own grandmother. As I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, the rich aroma of roasted meat, collard greens, and baked macaroni and cheese hit me. It was a sharp and painful contrast to the emotional coldness of the people waiting in the dining room. I walked into the formal dining space and found the scene already set. Preston was standing at the head of the long oak table, a position that traditionally belonged to my father. He was carving the roast with an air of smug authority that made my skin crawl. The sheer audacity of this man standing at the head of a black family table wielding the carving knife as if he were the patriarch was infuriating. But my parents allowed it, even encouraged it, simply because they believed his whiteness and his supposedly massive trust fund brought them adjacent prestige. Chantel sat to his right, inspecting her flawless manicure, while my parents watched him with adoring, validating eyes. I took my seat quietly at the far end of the table. Preston paused the carving knife suspended in the air and looked at me with a tight, condescending smile. He said it was nice of me to show up without the tornado today. He added that Chantel needed a stress-free environment right now to preserve her peace. The sheer disrespect of a man sitting in my parents' house eating their food and referring to my 5-year-old child as a natural disaster sent a surge of heat straight to my chest. Chantel immediately chimed in, sighing dramatically and rubbing her temples. She claimed her skin was breaking out from the sheer anxiety of dealing with unpredictable energy, and that she was grateful I finally had the common sense to leave my liability at home. I placed my linen napkin on my lap, keeping my face entirely blank. I told Preston I decided to give Zuri a peaceful afternoon away from the exhausting demands of adult expectations. My mother Brenda scoffed from across the table, pouring herself a generous glass of red wine. She said I always had to make everything sound like an attack, and that Preston was simply making a light-hearted observation. In this house, my family was allowed to throw daggers, but if I dared to bleed, I was the one ruining the mood. My father Jerome finally looked up from his plate. He had spent his entire life avoiding true conflict by enabling my mother's worst impulses, and today was no exception. He pointed his silver fork at me and told me to just be agreeable for once. He asked if I had taken care of the invoice for the Diamond Gala, yet pressing me to ensure the wire transfer was ready for the venue. Before I could even answer, he launched into a tangent about his own financial grievances. He complained bitterly about how expensive the dues at his exclusive country club had gotten this year. He looked at me with a calculating gleam in his eye, suggesting that since I had such a high-paying job at the equity firm, and no man to spend my money on, I should really step up and cover his membership fees. He said a good daughter would ensure her father could maintain his professional network. He actually looked me in the eye and said that since I was not providing a traditional family image for them to be proud of, the least I could do was provide financial utility. The audacity was breathtaking. My father was essentially demanding I fund his golf games because I was a single mother, framing his financial extortion as a penalty for my lack of a husband. He told me that since I did not have a partner to consult on financial matters, writing a check for his club dues should be an easy, unilateral decision. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, realizing he only saw me as a walking automated teller machine meant to sponsor the lifestyle he could no longer afford on his own. I swallowed the rage that threatened to spill out of my mouth. Getting angry would only give them the exact reaction they wanted. It would give them the ammunition to label me the bitter, aggressive woman they already believed me to be. Instead, I took a slow sip of my ice water and forced my muscles to relax. I told my father I would look into his country club dues right after I finalized the meticulous details for the gala. Then I turned my attention directly to the man sitting at the head of the table. I asked Preston how his new investment fund was going, mentioning casually that Mom had said his capital was completely tied up right now. Preston puffed out his chest, his fragile ego easily baited. He began boasting loudly about a massive incoming deal. He threw around buzzwords about venture capital, aggressive growth portfolios, and exclusive investor networking. He claimed he was on the verge of closing a multi-million-dollar acquisition that would triple his initial fund. Listening to him was almost comical. As a managing director who spent every day dissecting actual corporate acquisitions, I could hear the gaping holes in his pitch. He was using high-level finance jargon, incorrectly stringing together impressive-sounding phrases that amounted to absolute nonsense. But to my parents and Chantel, he sounded like a Wall Street genius. He looked down his nose at me, explaining that high-level finance was a complex game of optics and leverage, something a simple corporate manager like me might not fully grasp. He actually had the nerve to say that once his deal closed, he might let me review his prospectus so I could learn a thing or two about real wealth building and stop struggling on a single income. My mother beamed with absolute pride, reaching over to pat Preston on the arm, calling him a brilliant provider and a true visionary. Chantel sat up straighter, soaking in the unearned praise directed at her husband as if it validated her entire existence. As Preston continued to lecture me on the mechanics of private equity, my phone buzzed quietly against my leg in my dress pocket. I slipped it out under the table, keeping it carefully out of their line of sight. It was a text message from David, my acquisitions broker. I read the words glowing on the screen, my heart beating a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs. The message was clear and devastatingly perfect. The Sterling estate is facing foreclosure. The current deed holder defaulted on their primary loans 2 months ago and has been hiding the financial bleed. The bank is highly motivated to offload the toxic asset before the end of the quarter. We can buy the deed free and clear by Friday. I locked my screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. I looked back up at Preston, who was still rambling about his supposedly brilliant financial strategies and the affluent investors he was courting. He was entirely unaware that the luxurious stage he was planning to stand on, the very venue my mother had banned my daughter from, was about to be sold right out from under him. He was standing in a house of cards, bragging about the wind. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile that they mistook for submission. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at Preston. I told Preston I was incredibly eager to see exactly how his big deal played out. I told them all that I would handle the venue personally, guaranteeing that the Diamond Gala would be an unforgettable evening that everyone in their exclusive circle would be talking about for years to come. The next afternoon, I found myself driving through the manicured winding roads of the gated community where Chantel and Preston lived. My mother had texted me at 6 in the morning demanding I pick up a floral centerpiece sample from her preferred florist and deliver it directly to Chantel for final approval. Normally, I would have ignored such an absurd errand on a workday, but my new position as the prospective owner of the Sterling estate required me to play my role perfectly. I needed them comfortable. I needed them arrogant. I parked my car in the wide paved driveway behind Preston's leased luxury SUV. I carried the massive arrangement of white orchids and silver hydrangeas up the brick walkway. The house was massive but soulless, a textbook example of someone trying entirely too hard to project generational wealth. As I reached the top step, I noticed the heavy mahogany front door was slightly ajar. I raised my hand to knock, but the sound of shattering glass echoing from the foyer stopped me dead in my tracks. "I am not going to jail, Preston," Chantel shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual polished country club cadence. It was a raw, panicked scream. I froze, gripping the heavy glass vase. I pressed myself against the exterior wall just outside the cracked door and listened. "Keep your voice down," Preston hissed back, his tone dripping with condescension and sheer panic. "The neighbors can hear you. You are acting completely hysterical." "Hysterical," Chantel yelled, a sob breaking through her throat. "You drained my savings account. Every single dime is gone. You told me the new capital fund was oversubscribed. You told me we were seeing a 20% return. We hit a minor liquidity snag." Preston shot back, his voice tightening. "It is a temporary cash flow issue. That is how aggressive investment works, Chantel. You have to leverage capital to create capital." "Leverage what capital?" she fired back. "You leveraged my money and you lost it. But that is not even the worst part, is it, Preston? I saw the bank statements on your desk. You took the money out of Mom and Dad's retirement accounts." My heart slammed against my ribs. I stopped breathing entirely. I leaned closer to the crack in the door, focusing on every single word. "They gave me full authorization to manage their portfolio," Preston said defensively. "Your father signed the power of attorney paperwork last year. He trusts me. He knows I am the only one in this family who understands high-level wealth management." "You embezzled their retirement," Chantel cried out, her voice vibrating with absolute terror. "You took everything they worked for, and you burned it on bad trades to cover your own debts. If Dad finds out he is completely broke, he will have a heart attack. If the authorities find out, you will be arrested for fraud." "Nobody is getting arrested unless you keep screaming about it like a lunatic," Preston snapped. "Listen to me very carefully. The money is not gone, it is just temporarily displaced. That is exactly why this diamond gala has to happen flawlessly. A birthday party is not going to fix a $5 million hole in our finances." Chantel sobbed. "It is not just a birthday party," Preston said, his voice dropping into a desperate, persuasive rhythm. "I have invited 4 major angel investors to the gala. Men who can write 7-figure checks without blinking. If they walk into that venue and see us hosting a lavish high society event, they will assume the firm is incredibly healthy. They need to see the illusion of massive wealth. If I can secure their buy-in at the gala, I can use their initial capital to quietly replenish your parents' accounts before Jerome even notices the funds are missing." I stood on the porch, feeling a physical wave of nausea wash over me, followed immediately by a sharp, icy clarity. The golden child and her perfect husband were entirely bankrupt. Preston was not a financial genius. He was a cheap scam artist, running a desperate Ponzi scheme right under my parents' noses. My father had handed over his life savings to a white man in a tailored suit simply because Preston represented the proximity to power and status my parents so desperately craved. They trusted him blindly while treating me, their actual daughter, who managed multi-million-dollar private equity portfolios for a living, like an incompetent child. And now they were using my money to fund the cover-up. My mother had handed me a $25,000 invoice and banned my 5-year-old daughter from the room because Preston needed a flawless country club aesthetic to scam his investors and avoid federal prison. "Are you sure this will work?" Chantel asked, her voice trembling, sounding smaller than I had ever heard her. "It has to work," Preston replied firmly. "We just need to keep up appearances until Sunday. Do not say a word to your mother, and make sure your sister pays for the venue. We cannot afford a single disruption." Footsteps began clicking rapidly across the hardwood floor, heading straight for the entryway. I quickly stepped back from the wall, adjusting my posture and balancing the heavy floral arrangement in my arms. I plastered a look of mild annoyance on my face just as the front door swung open wide. Chantel stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes were bloodshot, her mascara was slightly smudged, and her chest was heaving. She stared at me, terror flashing briefly across her face as she tried to calculate how long I had been standing there. I did not give her the chance to panic. I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and shifted the weight of the flowers. "Your doorbell is broken, Chantel," I said, my tone dripping with casual boredom. "I have been standing here for 2 minutes trying to balance this heavy vase. Mom wanted me to drop off the centerpiece sample for your final approval." The relief that washed over Chantel's face was instantaneous. She swallowed hard, quickly wiping a stray tear from her cheek and lifting her chin. Within seconds, the terrified woman I had just overheard vanished, completely replaced by the arrogant, condescending sister she had always been. She smoothed down her designer blouse and looked down her nose at me. "You could have just knocked instead of loitering on my porch, Jada." She snapped, her voice recovering its usual haughty edge. "Just set the flowers on the console table inside. Try not to spill water on the hardwood." I walked past her, stepping into the grand foyer. I placed the orchids carefully on the table, glancing at the shattered remains of a crystal glass swept hastily into a corner near the staircase. I turned back to face my sister, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "They look fine," Chantel said, barely glancing at the flowers. Her eyes darted nervously toward the hallway where Preston had disappeared. She crossed her arms over her chest defensively. "More importantly, did you wire the money to the venue yet?" I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the desperation hiding just beneath her expensive makeup. She was willing to let our parents lose their entire life savings just to protect her fragile ego and her husband's fraudulent reputation. She was willing to let them treat my child like garbage to maintain a stage for a crime. "Do not embarrass us, Jada." Chantel pressed, her tone sharpening when I did not immediately answer. "Preston has very important colleagues attending. If his investors walk in and see a cheap party, or if the venue cancels on us, it is your fault. We need this gala to be absolutely perfect." I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second longer than was comfortable. I felt the absolute power of knowing I held her entire future in the palm of my hand. My money was not going to fund her husband's fraud. It was going to fund my ultimate acquisition. "You do not have to worry about a thing, Chantel," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. "I am handling the venue personally. The funds are already in motion. The investors are going to see exactly what kind of operation Preston is running." Chantel let out a breath she had clearly been holding, relaxing her tense shoulders. "Good," she muttered, turning away to dismiss me. "Just make sure the payment clears. You can see yourself out." I walked back to my car, stepping into the driver's seat and closing the door. I pulled my phone from my purse and immediately dialed David's number. "David," I said as soon as he answered, "I need to expedite the buyout of the Sterling estate. I want the final transfer papers ready for my signature by tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" David asked, sounding surprised. "We are still finalizing the catering absorption clauses. I do not care what it costs to speed it up," I replied, shifting my car into gear. "Buy the hospitality company, buy the catering contracts, buy the entire estate. I want full legal ownership before the end of the day tomorrow." I disconnected the call and drove out of the gated community. My sister wanted a flawless stage for her husband's investors. I was going to give her one. But when the curtain finally lifted, they were going to find out that I owned the entire theater. The glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of my firm offered a panoramic view of the city, but my eyes were locked entirely on the three sweating men sitting across the mahogany table. They were the executive board of the hospitality group that owned the Sterling estate. Less than 24 hours had passed since I left my sister standing in her foyer, and I had mobilized every resource at my disposal to force this meeting. The lead executive, a red-faced man named Charles, adjusted his collar and tried to act like a man who still had options. He attempted to pitch me a restructured loan agreement, painting a picture of temporary cash flow issues that could be solved with a simple capital injection. I let him talk for exactly 2 minutes before I slid a thick stack of financial disclosures across the table. I told Charles that I knew about their 3 missed mortgage payments, the shadow loans they had taken out to cover payroll, and the pending foreclosure notices that were scheduled to go public on Monday morning. I made it abundantly clear that he was not in a position to dictate terms. I was not there to offer a friendly bailout. I was there for a hostile takeover. Charles swallowed hard, his arrogant facade instantly crumbling. He scrambled to salvage the remaining profitable pieces of his business. He argued that the hospitality and catering contracts were the only arms keeping them afloat, desperately requesting to keep the event staffing separate from the real estate transfer. I leaned forward and placed my hands flat on the polished table. I told him I was buying the parent company entirely. I wanted the estate, the grounds, the staff, and every single catering contract currently on their books. If he refused my terms, I promised I would let the bank foreclose on Monday and buy the property for pennies at auction, leaving him with absolutely nothing but mounting legal fees and a ruined professional reputation. Watching Charles deflate reminded me of every time my father Jerome had dismissed my career. My father always told me that high-level corporate finance was a man's game. He actively encouraged me to settle for a safe, quiet administrative job so I could focus on finding a husband, all while he practically worshipped Preston for playing with trust fund money. My parents equated proximity to whiteness and inherited wealth as the ultimate standard of success. They never understood that building your own empire from the ground up as a black woman required a level of relentless grit and ruthlessness that Preston could never comprehend. Preston played business with unearned safety nets. I fought with my back against the wall, knowing nobody was coming to save me. That was exactly why I was sitting at the head of this table dictating multi-million-dollar terms, while Preston was busy draining my parents' retirement accounts to fund a scam. Charles looked at his lawyers, who simply nodded in defeat. They agreed to the total buyout. David, my acquisitions broker, slid the final transfer deeds in front of me. I picked up my favorite gold pen, the one I only used for major victories. Right as the tip of the pen touched the heavy paper, my cell phone began ringing loudly against the glass table. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. I did not silence it. I tapped the speakerphone button and set the device right next to the contract. Brenda did not even say hello. She immediately started screaming, her voice shrill and echoing off the boardroom walls. She demanded to know why the venue coordinator had just called her in an absolute panic. She yelled that the $25,000 wire transfer had not cleared the bank yet. She said the head caterer was threatening to cancel the entire Diamond Gala menu and pull his service staff if the funds were not secured in the next 10 minutes. I kept my eyes locked on Charles as I signed the first page of the deed. I told my mother in a calm, measured voice that bank wires sometimes require manual clearance for large amounts, and that she needed to take a breath and calm down. My mother scoffed loudly, the sound dripping with absolute contempt. She told me I was entirely useless. She said this was exactly why I was struggling in life and why I could not keep a man to help me. She yelled that I could not even handle a simple banking task without creating a crisis and embarrassing the family. She reminded me that Preston had major venture capitalists attending tomorrow night, and if the food was not perfectly executed, I would be solely responsible for ruining his crucial business opportunities. She actually said I was lucky they were even letting me attend the gala, considering what a massive burden I always proved to be. The executives across the table stared at the phone in stunned silence. They were watching a high-powered managing director, a woman who had just mercilessly acquired their entire company, being berated like an incompetent child over a party deposit. I did not break eye contact with Charles. I flipped to the final page of the deed. I signed my name with a sharp, definitive flourish, legally transferring total ownership of the Sterling estate and its entire hospitality group into my private holding company. I capped my pen and pushed the executed documents back toward David. I leaned closer to the phone. I told my mother she did not need to worry about the wire transfer anymore. I told her the catering is fully secured, Mom. The owner just personally guaranteed it. The Sterling estate was a sprawling 19th-century mansion surrounded by acres of manicured botanical gardens and towering oak trees. I pulled my car onto the pristine gravel driveway on Friday afternoon for the final walkthrough of the Diamond Gala. The air outside was thick with the sweet smell of fresh magnolias, but the atmosphere inside the grand double doors smelled entirely of incoming disaster. I walked into the main ballroom where crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over the absolute chaos below. Preston was standing in the dead center of the dance floor, shouting at a team of florists. He was wearing a pastel polo shirt and expensive loafers, looking exactly like a man who had never worked a hard day in his life, but felt entirely entitled to the labor of everyone around him. He snapped his fingers aggressively at a server carrying a tray of sample champagne flutes, demanding that the young man move faster. The venue staff exchanged tight, strained glances with one another. They were highly trained hospitality professionals, but more importantly, they were also my employees now. David, my broker, had briefed the estate management team early that morning about the overnight ownership transfer. The staff knew exactly who I was. They knew I had just signed the deed absorbing their entire parent company to save them from imminent foreclosure. And they knew Preston was nothing more than a loud, profoundly broke guest who was currently barking orders in a building he could not even afford to rent. Preston spotted me walking toward the main stage. He did not say hello. He did not say thank you for securing the $25,000 payment that kept the lights on. Instead, he marched over and thrust a heavy plastic clipboard directly at my chest. He told me the guest list was finalized and that I needed to stand at the front check-in table tomorrow night like a glorified bouncer. He looked me up and down with absolute disdain, his eyes lingering on my tailored business suit as if it offended him. He told me that since Zuri is not here, you have free hands. You can manage the door and keep the wrong element out. Try to look presentable, Jada. We cannot afford any of your usual attitudes when my colleagues arrive. I looked down at the clipboard in my hands. I looked back up at his smug, arrogant face. I wanted to tell him that the only wrong element in the building was the fraud standing in front of me, actively living off stolen retirement funds. I wanted to laugh and ask him how exactly he planned to impress venture capitalists when he was secretly drowning in debt. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath. I gripped the edges of the clipboard and told him I would make sure every single guest was handled perfectly. Off to the side of the room, my mother, Brenda, and my sister Chantel were arguing with the head chef over the truffle risotto. Chantel was complaining loudly that the gold leaf garnish was not thick enough to look good on camera. Brenda kept reminding the visibly exhausted chef that they were a highly prominent family and expected nothing less than absolute perfection. I stood there and watched my mother parade around a room that I owned, demanding free upgrades from the very culinary staff that I now paid. My father, Jerome, caught my eye from across the room. He jogged over quickly, grabbing me by the elbow and pulling me into a quiet, shadowed alcove near the coat check. I expected a basic thank you for covering the massive invoice. I expected a tiny sliver of gratitude. Instead, he looked around nervously, checking over his shoulder to make sure Preston could not hear us talking. He leaned in close and told me to keep my head down tomorrow night. He said Preston had very important high-net-worth investors flying in from out of state, and the family needed to present a united, stable front. My father actually looked his own daughter in the eye and told me not to outshine my sister. He explained that Preston was courting conservative traditional men who valued traditional family structures. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper and said, "You being a single mother is complicated for his brand. It raises questions we do not want to answer right now. Just stay in the back. Do not wear anything too flashy and let Chantel and Preston take the spotlight." The pain of his words hit me squarely in the chest, but it was quickly swallowed by a profound, sickening pity. Jerome was so deeply addicted to the illusion of country club prestige that he was willing to shove his own flesh and blood into a closet just to appease a white son-in-law. My father was practicing a toxic brand of respectability politics, begging me to hide my reality so Preston could look like a savior. Jerome was asking me to shrink myself to protect the fragile ego of a man who was actively robbing his retirement accounts blind. He was willing to sacrifice his black daughter to maintain proximity to white wealth that did not even exist anymore. I nodded slowly, looking at the desperation lined deep in my father's face. I told him I completely understood the assignment. I promised him I would stay right where I belonged, and that Preston would get exactly the spotlight he deserved tomorrow night. Jerome let out a loud, heavy sigh of relief. He patted my shoulder awkwardly before rushing back out to the ballroom floor to compliment Preston on his choice of table linens. I stood in the alcove and waited. I waited until my mother finished berating the chef. I waited until Chantel finished snapping photos of the empty stage. I waited until they all gathered their designer bags and walked out the front doors. I watched through the grand windows as their cars disappeared down the long, winding driveway. Once the coast was entirely clear, I turned around and walked straight to the head venue manager. His name was Thomas. He stood rigidly by the catering doors holding a thick binder of event notes, looking like a man bracing himself for another round of insults. His posture instantly shifted to respect when I approached him. I smiled warmly at him and thanked him for his patience with my family. Then I told Thomas we were making a slight but mandatory adjustment to the seating chart. I told him to change the floor plan immediately. I instructed him to take Preston and his VIP investor tables and move them right next to the main stage microphone. I looked Thomas dead in the eye and told him they need to hear every single word I say tomorrow. The Sterling estate looked absolutely magnificent on Saturday night. The grand ballroom was a masterclass in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the perfectly arranged tables. The floral centerpieces I had ordered towered above the crisp white linens, cascading with white roses and silver hydrangeas. Soft jazz music floated through the air, provided by a live band, positioned perfectly on the main stage. I stood in the shadows of the grand foyer, observing the room through the slightly parted heavy oak doors. It was a beautiful stage set for a spectacular disaster. My mother Brenda was holding court near the center of the room. She was wearing the lavish silver gown she had been fitted for at the boutique, dripping in what I knew for a fact were rented diamonds. She laughed loudly at a joke someone made, tossing her head back to ensure the photographer captured her good side. She looked like a woman who had completely secured her place in high society, oblivious to the fact that her entire performance was being subsidized by the daughter she despised. Over by the mahogany bar, Chantel and Preston were in full hustle mode. Preston was wearing a bespoke tuxedo, holding a glass of scotch, and aggressively schmoozing a group of older, wealthy white men. These were the high-roller investors he had lured to the gala under false pretenses. He was laughing, clapping them on the shoulder and pointing around the room as if he personally owned every brick in the building. Chantel stood plastered to his side, smiling a tight, rehearsed smile, playing the perfect submissive, affluent wife. She looked absolutely terrified behind her designer makeup. I looked down at my side. Zuri was holding my hand tightly, bouncing slightly on the balls of her feet. She was not a tornado. She was not a liability. She was a beautiful, joyful 5-year-old girl who deserved to be celebrated, not hidden away in a closet to protect a fragile, fraudulent ego. My mother had explicitly instructed me to wear a dull, shapeless, matte gray dress she had picked out for me. She wanted me to look like the help, someone who would fade into the background and not draw a single ounce of attention away from Chantel. I had thrown that gray dress directly into the trash the moment I bought the Sterling estate. Instead, I was wearing a custom floor-length emerald green gown that hugged my curves perfectly. The silk cascaded down to the floor, catching the light with every movement. My natural hair, the same hair Chantel claimed ruined her aesthetic, was styled in a stunning, voluminous updo that demanded respect. And holding my hand was Zuri, wearing a miniature matching emerald green dress with a tulle skirt that made her look like an absolute princess. She had a bright, joyful smile on her face, completely oblivious to the toxic dynamics waiting on the other side of the doors. "Are you ready, baby?" I asked softly, squeezing her small hand. Zuri beamed up at me. "I look like a princess, mommy." "You are a princess," I told her firmly. "And princesses do not hide in the back." I pushed the heavy oak doors open wide. The heavy wood groaned slightly, a sound that cut through the soft jazz music playing in the ballroom. We stepped into the light. The effect was instantaneous. Heads turned, conversations paused. I walked into the room with my head held high, my posture radiating absolute authority. Zuri walked happily beside me, her tulle skirt swishing with every step. We did not look like the family scapegoat and the inconvenient burden. We looked like the owners of the building. It took exactly 4 seconds for Brenda to spot us. I watched the progression of emotions flash across my mother's face in real time. First, there was confusion as her brain failed to register the vibrant emerald green color she had expressly forbidden. Then there was shock as she realized I was holding the hand of the child she had permanently banned from the premises. Finally, a deep, ugly purple rage crept up her neck and settled into her cheeks. The rented diamonds around her neck shook as she practically sprinted across the ballroom floor. She weaved through the crowd of guests, keeping a stiff, terrifying smile plastered on her face for the sake of the photographers, but her eyes were completely feral. She reached us before we even made it past the entryway. She grabbed my upper arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin, and yanked me toward a shadowed corner near the coat check. She leaned in close, her breath hot and furious against my ear. "What is that child doing here?" She hissed, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper. "I told you she was banned. I told you I needed a flawless evening." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm, smoothing the silk of my dress where she had wrinkled it. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to match her frantic energy. "Zuri is my daughter, Mom. Where I go, she goes." "You are wearing green!" Brenda choked out as if my wardrobe choice was a personal assault on her life. "I told you to wear the gray dress. You are deliberately trying to ruin my diamond gala. I want you to take her and leave this instant before you ruin the professional photography." Security. She began looking around frantically for the guards stationed at the doors. Over by the bar, the commotion had not gone unnoticed. Chantel had spotted us. Her jaw dropped open, all the color draining from her face. She immediately nudged Preston and pointed frantically in our direction. Preston excused himself from the group of wealthy investors, his face hardening into a mask of pure annoyance. He marched across the ballroom floor, his heavy footsteps echoing his entitlement. He did not care about optics the way Brenda did. He was furious that his carefully constructed illusion of a perfect wealthy family dynamic was being threatened by my presence. He stormed up to us, ignoring me completely, to glare down at Zuri, who instinctively hid behind my leg. Preston reached out and aggressively grabbed my forearm, his grip tight and bruising. He leaned into my face, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cheap desperation. "Get the kid out of here right now before you ruin my networking," he growled through clenched teeth. "I told you to stay in the back and manage the door. You are making us look completely ghetto in front of men who can write me seven-figure checks. Take the brat and leave." The sheer audacity of this bankrupt, fraudulent man, putting his hands on me in a building I owned, sent a surge of adrenaline straight through my veins. The days of shrinking myself to protect their fragile egos were entirely over. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I looked back up into his panicked, arrogant eyes. I yanked my arm back with a sharp, violent motion, breaking his grip completely. I stepped into his personal space, bringing my face inches from his, letting him see the absolute, unfiltered danger in my eyes. "Call security, Preston," I said, my voice ringing out clear and razor-sharp over the soft jazz music. "I dare you." The music playing from the live jazz band seemed to fade into a dull hum as two absolute mountains of men in tailored black suits marched across the polished ballroom floor. They moved with the kind of synchronized military precision that you only see in highly trained security details. Brenda spotted them approaching, and her face instantly lit up with malicious triumph. She thought her salvation had arrived. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, the rented diamonds around her wrist clinking together loudly. She demanded that they remove me and my child immediately. She practically spat the words, insisting that we were trespassing, that we were not on the approved guest list, and that we were causing a severe disturbance to her flawless evening. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, rocking back on his expensive heels, a smug and victorious grin spreading across his face. He actually had the audacity to adjust his bow tie, waiting for the guards to physically drag a black woman and her 5-year-old daughter out of the venue in front of his wealthy white colleagues. It was the exact kind of public humiliation they had subjected me to for my entire life. But tonight, the rules of engagement had entirely changed. The head of security, a towering man with broad shoulders and a completely neutral expression, stopped inches away from Preston. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at my brother-in-law. Instead, he turned his body entirely toward me. He clasped his hands respectfully behind his back, straightened his posture to full attention, and bowed his head slightly. He asked in a deep, booming voice, "If there was a problem, Ms. Williams." He asked if I needed these particular guests escorted off the premises. The absolute silence that fell over my mother and Preston was nothing short of cinematic. Brenda choked on her own breath, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in pure shock. Preston dropped his arms, the smug grin wiped completely off his face, as if he had just been struck by a physical blow. They stared at the security guard, and then they stared at me, their brains entirely short-circuiting as they tried to process the hierarchy they were witnessing. Preston stumbled backward a step, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what the guard meant by calling me Ms. Williams. He yelled that he was the one who rented this venue, that he was the one who provided the VIP guest list, and he ordered the guard to do his job and escort me out. I did not even dignify Preston with a direct response. I kept my eyes locked on the head of security. I smiled warmly and told him that everything was under control for the moment, but requested that he keep a very close eye on the bar area because certain guests were clearly overstepping their boundaries and had too much to drink. The guard nodded respectfully, stepping back and glaring directly at Preston with his arms crossed over his massive chest. I squeezed Zuri's small hand. We glided right past my mother and my brother-in-law, leaving them completely frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer humiliation of a venue staff member blatantly ignoring their commands. I led my daughter straight across the center of the ballroom, our matching emerald green gowns catching the light of every crystal chandelier in the room. I headed directly for the velvet-roped section near the main stage, the VIP tables, the exact area my father had begged me to stay away from. Preston finally snapped out of his paralyzed state when he realized exactly where I was walking. Panic overrode his confusion. He scrambled after me, his leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. He hissed at my back, keeping his voice low so his colleagues would not hear his desperation. He told me I was making a massive mistake. He said those tables were strictly reserved for his high-net-worth investors, men who dealt in global equity and multi-million-dollar acquisitions. He told me they had zero interest in making small talk with a mid-level corporate drone who brought a child to a networking event. I ignored his frantic whispering. We reached the main VIP table just as the centerpiece guest of the evening turned around from the bar. It was an older, distinguished white man with silver hair and a sharp-tailored suit, holding a glass of sparkling water. This was the whale Preston had been trying to harpoon all night. The man whose capital was supposed to save Preston from federal prison and replenish my parents' drained retirement accounts. Preston practically shoved his way past me to get to the man first. He pasted on a desperate, sweaty smile, holding his hand out for a handshake, fully prepared to apologize for the unwanted interruption caused by his unruly sister-in-law. But the older man did not even glance at Preston. His eyes landed directly on me and his face broke into a massive, genuine smile of pure delight. He stepped right past Preston's outstretched hand and opened his arms warmly. He said my name with absolute excitement. He told me it was a spectacular surprise to see me there. He announced loudly, so everyone at the surrounding tables could hear that he was just telling the executive board yesterday about my excellent portfolio restructure last quarter. He praised my brilliant execution and relentless market strategy. Preston stood there frozen with his hand still suspended in the empty air. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped in a rented tuxedo. His eyes darted wildly between the older man and me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stared at the man, then looked at me, his voice literally trembling as he asked how we knew each other. I turned to my brother-in-law with a perfectly calm, deeply satisfied smile. I smoothed my hand over Zuri's curls and explained to Preston that this was Mr. Sterling, the very man Preston thought was an independent angel investor. The man Preston had been begging for a bailout loan all evening. I looked Preston dead in the eye and told him that Mr. Sterling was a senior partner at my private equity firm, and more importantly, he reported directly to me. Mr. Sterling let out a booming laugh that seemed to shake Preston right out of his expensive loafers. He reached out and shook my hand with the kind of genuine respect that Preston had been begging for all night. He told me that my restructuring of the commercial real estate portfolio had saved the firm millions this quarter, and that he was absolutely thrilled to see me out enjoying myself. Preston stood there frozen in his bespoke tuxedo. His face was completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to notice him. He tried to open his mouth to speak, to somehow insert himself into the dynamic and reclaim his position of authority, but no sound came out. Mr. Sterling looked down and noticed my daughter. Zuri offered him a bright missing tooth smile and gave a small, polite wave. Mr. Sterling completely ignored Preston to lean down and tell Zuri that her dress was the most beautiful shade of green he had ever seen. Zuri beamed with pride, thanking him and explaining that she matched her mommy. It was a perfectly innocent, charming interaction, but to Preston it was the sound of his entire fraudulent empire crumbling to the ground. That was when Chantel finally broke through the crowd. She had been watching the interaction from the bar, and seeing her husband completely sidelined by the sister she despised was more than her fragile ego could handle. She marched over her rented diamonds sparkling under the chandeliers and physically wedged her body between me and the plush velvet chair I was about to pull out for Zuri. Chantel leaned in close, her eyes wide and frantic. The scent of her expensive perfume could not hide the sheer desperation rolling off her skin. She kept her voice in a harsh, venomous whisper, terrified that the wealthy white men at the table would hear her. She told me I was ruining her husband's deals. She aggressively grabbed my wrist and hissed that I was making them look ghetto in front of his colleagues. There it was, the ultimate insult she kept loaded in her arsenal. Growing up, Chantel had always used that word to police my behavior. Whenever I spoke too passionately, whenever I embraced my natural hair, whenever I refused to shrink myself to fit into the country club aesthetic, our mother-worshipped Chantel was there to remind me that I was an embarrassment. She had spent her entire adult life molding herself to be the perfect, palatable black wife to a wealthy white man, erasing every piece of her own identity to secure her proximity to his supposed power. Seeing me command respect from the very man her husband was trying to swindle completely broke her brain. I looked down at her hand gripping my wrist. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I did not give her the satisfaction of reacting to her racialized insult. I simply looked her dead in the eye, raised my right hand, and snapped my fingers. The response was instantaneous. A waiter in a crisp white jacket who had been hovering discreetly a few feet away materialized immediately at my side. Without uttering a single word, he reached forward and firmly grasped the heavy velvet chair that Chantel had her hand resting on. With one smooth, practiced motion, he pulled the chair entirely away from the table. Chantel had been leaning her weight against it to block my path. When the chair vanished, she stumbled forward awkwardly, her arms flailing as she desperately tried to catch her balance. Her 6-inch designer heels wobbled dangerously on the polished hardwood floor, and she let out a sharp, undignified gasp. She barely managed to stay upright, but the damage was done. The only available seat at that side of the table had been removed. Chantel was forced to stand there awkwardly, holding her champagne flute, looking entirely foolish and displaced. I smoothly stepped around her, pulling out the adjacent chair for myself, and lifting Zuri onto my lap. I smoothed my emerald gown and turned my attention back to Mr. Sterling, seamlessly picking up our conversation about market trends, as if my sister were nothing more than a minor draft of wind that had just passed through the room. Chantel was left standing behind us, her face burning with humiliation, entirely locked out of the inner circle. She looked at Preston for help, but Preston was currently experiencing a full-blown panic attack. Preston realized that his financial future was slipping right through his fingers. He had invited these venture capitalists here to project the illusion of massive wealth, hoping to secure a bailout loan that would hide the fact that he had embezzled my parents' entire retirement fund. But instead of looking like a titan of industry, he was standing awkwardly at his own table while his target investor fawned over his sister-in-law. He could see the other investors at the table whispering to each other, casting confused and doubtful glances in his direction. The carefully constructed facade was shattering. Desperation makes arrogant men do incredibly foolish things. Preston decided that if he could not control the table, he needed to control the entire room. He needed a public spectacle to re-establish his dominance and paint the picture of the happy, wealthy family he supposedly led. He abandoned Chantel standing awkwardly in her heels and adjusted his bow tie. He pasted on a wide, blindingly fake smile and marched directly toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he signaled the live jazz band to stop playing. The musicians, who were ultimately on my payroll, hesitated for a moment before letting the music fade into a slow, quiet halt. A hush fell over the grand ballroom as hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the stage. Preston stepped up to the main podium. He grabbed the microphone off the stand, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed his privilege would always save him. He planned to give a toast. He was going to pitch his successful family dynamic to the room of investors to praise my mother and to publicly assert himself as the generous patriarch who had funded this lavish diamond gala. He tapped the microphone twice. The sound echoed clearly across the silent room. He opened his mouth, taking a deep breath to project his voice and reclaim his narrative. But I was already 2 steps ahead of him. I caught the eye of the head sound engineer standing at the mixing board in the back of the room. I gave him a single definitive nod. Before Preston could utter a single syllable, the microphone went completely dead, followed instantly by a loud, ear-piercing screech of feedback that made every single guest in the ballroom flinch and cover their ears. The sharp screech of the dead microphone echoed off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. Preston stood frozen on the main stage, his mouth hanging open as the feedback faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. He tapped the metal grill of the microphone with his index finger. A dull, hollow thud rang out. He tapped it again, his face flushing red as he looked frantically toward the sound engineer in the back of the room. The engineer simply crossed his arms, his face entirely blank, completely ignoring the frantic hand gestures of the man pretending to run the show. I stood up from the VIP table, smoothing the silk of my emerald gown. I looked down at Zuri, who was happily eating a strawberry from a crystal bowl, completely insulated from the adult warfare happening around her. I gave her a quick smile, then turned my attention to the stage. I walked toward the front of the ballroom with deliberate, measured steps. The guests parted from me instinctively. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, intoxicating scent of incoming destruction had settled over the room, and every wealthy investor, every country club socialite, and every catering staff member was watching my every move. I climbed the 3 short steps to the main stage. Preston was still standing behind the podium, sweating through his custom tuxedo, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. I walked right up to him. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply looked at him and stepped into his space, forcing him to step back. He stumbled slightly, his expensive loafers catching on the carpeted stage, yielding the podium to me. I grabbed the microphone stand. The moment my hand touched the metal, the sound engineer flipped the switch. A soft, clear hum indicated the audio was perfectly live and ready for my voice. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Chantel still standing awkwardly by the VIP table, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. I saw my father Jerome shrinking back into the shadows near the bar, already sensing the catastrophic failure of his respectability politics. And I saw my mother Brenda, her eyes wide with mounting panic. I leaned into the microphone. My voice resonated crisp and dominant across the massive ballroom. "Welcome everyone to my property." The silence that followed was absolute. The clinking of champagne flutes stopped entirely. The soft murmurs of conversation died in the throats of the elite guests. You could have heard a single pin drop on the hardwood floor. I looked directly at the VIP table where Mr. Sterling sat, watching his expression shift from polite curiosity to sharp predatory interest. He was a man who understood power plays, and he knew he was watching a masterclass. "Down on the floor!" My mother snapped into action. Brenda had spent her entire adult life managing the optics of our family, burying ugly truths under layers of rented designer clothes and forced country club smiles. She could not stand the silence. She could not stand the fact that the narrative had been ripped from her perfectly manicured hands. She rushed forward, stepping into the center of the dance floor, her silver-beaded gown sparkling desperately under the lights. She grabbed a fresh flute of champagne from a passing waiter and thrust it high into the air, forcing a shrill, artificially bright laugh that echoed painfully in the quiet room. "She means she paid for the party, folks!" Brenda yelled, her voice trembling slightly under the strain of her fake enthusiasm. "Give it up for my generous daughter. She is always so dramatic with her phrasing. Let us hear a round of applause for Jada for covering the venue cost tonight." Brenda started clapping loudly, looking around the room with wild, begging eyes. Chantel immediately joined in, slapping her hands together with frantic energy. A few confused guests near the back politely tapped their hands together, but the applause quickly sputtered out and died. The heavy hitters in the room, the men with the actual money, did not clap. They were looking at me, waiting for the punchline. This was exactly what my mother had always done. She had spent 33 years framing my hard-earned achievements as mere generosity or dumb luck, while framing Chantel and Preston's absolute failures as temporary setbacks on the road to inevitable greatness. When I paid off the mortgage on my parents' first home, Brenda told the church congregation that the bank made a favorable error. When I landed my position as managing director, she told her friends it was a diversity quota hire. She was completely incapable of acknowledging my power, because doing so would mean acknowledging that the daughter she treated like a burden was the only actual pillar holding her entire life together. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I shook my head slowly, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. No, Brenda. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice cutting through her desperate illusion like a scalpel. I hold the deed to the Sterling estate. I bought it on Thursday morning. I own the grounds, I own the building, and I own the hospitality group servicing your food right now. Brenda physically recoiled, her hand dropping to her side, the champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her glass. Her jaw went slack. The rented diamonds around her neck seemed to lose their sparkle as the blood completely drained from her face. I turned my gaze away from my mother and looked directly at the VIP table. I locked eyes with Mr. Sterling, then shifted my focus to the other three venture capitalists sitting beside him. Which is incredibly funny. I continued, my voice amplifying the pure devastation in the room. Because Preston here told you all during cocktail hour that he owned a 20% stake in this venue. He used that imaginary equity to inflate his portfolio and pitch you a fraudulent capital fund. Loud audible gasps echoed across the ballroom. The wealthy investors physically pulled back from the table, their faces twisting in absolute disgust and shock. They were men who dealt in facts, in hard assets, in verified ledgers. To be lied to about commercial real estate ownership was not just an insult, it was a profound, unforgivable business sin. Mr. Sterling stood up from his chair. He did not look at me. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at Preston. The disgust radiating from the senior partner was palpable. He looked at my brother-in-law like he was a cockroach that had somehow managed to crawl onto a silver platter. I turned my head to look at Preston. He had gone paper white. His skin was the color of dirty chalk and sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. His entire body was trembling. The facade of the wealthy, connected white finance bro had been entirely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. He was standing on my stage in my building, completely exposed as a desperate, pathetic fraud. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a defense, trying to find a lie big enough to cover the massive hole he had just fallen into. But there were no lies left. There was no trust fund to save him. There was no more stolen retirement money to hide behind. He was entirely out of leverage, and I was holding all the cards. Preston let out a guttural sound that was half scream and half sob. The pristine country club facade he had worn for the last decade shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. He abandoned all pretense of high society etiquette and lunged toward the stage. His face was contorted with absolute terror and rage. He thought he could just rush the podium, rip the microphone from my hands, and somehow silence the truth before it completely destroyed him. He actually believed his physical presence would intimidate me into submission, the way it had always intimidated my father. I did not even make it to the first step of the stage. The head of security, the same massive man Preston had tried to weaponize against me earlier, stepped seamlessly into his path. Two guards grabbed Preston by the shoulders, twisting his arms behind his back with practiced and effortless precision. Preston thrashed and kicked his custom Italian loafers, scuffing against the polished hardwood floor. He yelled my name, demanding that I turn off the microphone, demanding that I show some respect for the family. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He was demanding respect while being pinned like a common thief in front of the very venture capitalists he had planned to swindle. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked down at him, struggling against the guards, and reached into the pocket of my emerald gown. I pulled out my phone, unlocked the screen, and opened the presentation application I had prepared with David earlier that afternoon. I tapped a single button. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage, which had been displaying a looping, elegant monogram of my mother's initials, instantly went dark. A second later, they flared back to life with a bright, unforgiving white light that illuminated the entire ballroom. The sudden glare cast long shadows across the faces of the wealthy elite gathered on the floor. I turned my head slightly to look at the screens, making sure the resolution was perfectly sharp. On the left side of the massive display was a high-definition scan of the invoice Brenda had slid across the glass table at the bridal boutique, the $25,000 bill for the Sterling Estate venue and catering, the exact amount she demanded I pay to fund her illusion of grandeur. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice echoing crisply off the crystal chandeliers. I told the room to look closely at the screen. I explained that my mother had handed me this invoice just a few days ago, telling me to be a good, agreeable daughter and cover the costs, because Preston's vast capital was temporarily tied up in aggressive hedge fund investments. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the wealthy investors in the room digest the blatant lie they had been fed all evening. Then I tapped my phone screen again. A new document materialized on the right side of the projection. It was a certified federal bankruptcy filing. I read the name at the top of the filing out loud. Preston Thomas Vance. I read the date, noting it was filed over 6 months ago. The room erupted into a collective gasp. The quiet murmurs of the high society crowd turned into a loud, chaotic buzz of disbelief. I watched Mr. Sterling cross his arms, his face hardening into a mask of absolute disgust. I explained to the crowd that Preston was not waiting on a liquidity event. Preston was completely, entirely, and legally bankrupt. He had leveraged his family's dwindling trust fund on terrible trades, trying to play in a financial league he did not understand, and he had lost every single cent. Preston stopped struggling against the guards. He hung his head, his chest heaving as the reality of his public exposure finally set in. But I was not finished. The deep well of resentment my family had dug over 33 years demanded a complete and total reckoning. I tapped the screen one last time. 2 banking statements replaced the bankruptcy filing. The names on the accounts belonged to my parents, Jerome and Brenda Williams. The balances displayed at the bottom of both statements read $0.00. Down on the floor, the color completely drained from my father's face. Jerome staggered backward, knocking into a cocktail table and sending a tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering glass mirrored the sudden violent destruction of his reality. He stared at the giant screens, his mouth opening and closing without any sound. He had given Preston full power of attorney over his retirement portfolios. I had handed his entire life savings to a mediocre white man, simply because Preston looked like the kind of wealth my father desperately wanted to be associated with. Jerome had trusted a scam artist over his own daughter, a woman who managed private equity for a living, simply because my existence as an independent single black woman did not fit his outdated, narrow-minded view of what success looked like. Chantel was hyperventilating. She clutched her chest, sinking to her knees right there on the dance floor in her expensive rented gown. She knew about the bankruptcy, but seeing the drained retirement accounts projected at 30 feet tall was the final nail in the coffin. She knew her husband had robbed her parents blind, and she had gone along with the gala anyway, hoping to use my money to set a stage to scam Mr. Sterling and his colleagues into bailing them out. She knelt on the floor, covering her face with her hands, sobbing loudly as the high society peers she worshipped stared down at her with unfiltered pity and contempt. I looked down at Brenda. My mother was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes darting between the zero balance on the screen and my face. She looked small, stripped of her arrogance, stripped of the unearned pride she used to bludgeon me with at every family gathering. There was no more aesthetic to protect. There was no more prestige to claim. There was only the ugly, undeniable truth projected for the entire city to see. I gripped the sides of the podium, leaning close into the microphone, so my voice carried to the very back of the estate. My mother banned my 5-year-old daughter tonight because she was too wild and would ruin the photos. Yet she expected me to fund this facade to hide the fact that her golden son-in-law has embezzled her entire retirement. My father stared at the towering digital screens for what felt like an eternity. The zero balance on his retirement account finally registered in his mind, shattering his carefully constructed reality. The country club dues, the golf, the luxury cars he leased to keep up appearances, all of it was gone. The shock morphed into a violently red, unhinged rage. Jerome spun around and lunged at Preston. He grabbed the lapels of Preston's custom tuxedo, screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know where his money was. He shook the man he had treated like an absolute king, yelling that he had trusted him, that Preston had promised him a guaranteed 20% return and total financial security. Preston, still pinned by my security guards, whimpered and tried to blame market volatility. He stammered that it was just a temporary liquidity crisis, sweating profusely as his father-in-law shoved him against the edge of a cocktail table. Jerome spat at his feet, roaring that Preston was nothing but a common thief in a tailored suit. My father had spent years silencing me, telling me to be agreeable, telling me to fund this very party to protect Preston's brand. Now, the man he had chosen over his own black daughter had left him entirely destitute. The display of absolute dysfunction was the final straw for the venture capitalists. Mr. Sterling buttoned his suit jacket with a look of profound revulsion. He looked down at Preston struggling against the guards and told him that if he ever attempted to contact their firm again, he would personally ensure Preston faced federal wire fraud charges. The other investors followed his lead. They did not just walk out. They marched out in a synchronized block of wealth and power, completely disgusted by the scam they had been lured into. As Mr. Sterling passed the stage, he looked up at me, gave a firm nod of professional respect, and walked out the heavy oak doors. Preston watched his entire financial future walk out of the ballroom, letting out a hollow, agonizing sob. Down on the dance floor, Chantel was completely unraveling. The golden child was kneeling on the hardwood floor in her rented designer gown, sobbing so hard she was hyperventilating. The high society friends she had spent years trying to impress were backing away from her like she was carrying a highly contagious disease. Several of them had their phones out, openly recording her humiliation. She reached out toward a woman she played tennis with, begging her to understand that she had no idea Preston was broke. The woman simply turned her back and walked toward the exit. Chantel realized in real time that her proximity to whiteness and supposed wealth was the only reason these people had ever tolerated her. Without Preston's money, she was entirely invisible to them. My mother saw the investors leave. She saw the society wives fleeing toward the coat check. She looked at her husband having a total breakdown and her favorite daughter weeping on the floor. Then she looked up at me. I watched the exact moment her survival instinct kicked in. Brenda realized that the only person left in the room who possessed actual wealth was the very daughter she had spent 33 years trying to break. She abandoned all her pride. She hiked up the skirt of her heavy silver gown and practically sprinted toward the main stage. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. These were not her usual manipulative, performative tears. This was genuine, absolute terror. She reached the edge of the stage and gripped the wooden stairs, looking up at me with wide, begging eyes. "Jada, baby, please," she cried, her voice cracking as she desperately tried to use a pet name she had not spoken since I was a child. "We did not know. I swear to you, we did not know. Preston lied to us. He manipulated your father. You have to help us. We have absolutely no money left. The bank sent a notice last week, and they are going to take our house. We are going to lose everything." I looked down at the woman who had banned my 5-year-old daughter from this very room just a few hours ago because she claimed my child would ruin her perfect aesthetic. I looked at the mother who had called me a failure, who had mocked my independence, and who had expected me to quietly fund her fraudulent lifestyle while staying hidden in the shadows. I stepped back from the microphone and looked her dead in the eye. "I did help you, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly steady and ice cold. "I paid for the catering. Eat up." The heavy silence following my words seemed to press down on my mother physically. Brenda slumped onto the polished hardwood floor, the heavy silver beads of her rented gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She stared at me with her mouth open, but no words came out. There were no more manipulative tears, no more gaslighting, and no more demands for respect. For the first time in my 33 years of life, my mother was completely and utterly speechless. I turned my back on her. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or obligation. I looked over at Thomas, the head venue manager, who was standing quietly near the edge of the stage. He had watched my family treat his staff like absolute garbage all evening. He had stood there with a tight jaw while Preston barked orders at him, and my mother degraded his culinary team. Now he stood at attention, his posture perfectly straight, waiting for my command. I gave him a sharp, definitive nod. I told Thomas that the party was officially over. I instructed him to have the catering staff clear the room entirely, to break down the tables, and to turn the house lights all the way up. Then I looked down at the massive security guards, who were still keeping a firm perimeter around the stage. I told them to escort my former family off my property immediately. I looked down at Zuri, who was gently tugging on the emerald silk fabric of my gown, letting out a small, tired yawn. I knelt down, smoothed her beautiful natural curls, and announced to the empty, echoing ballroom that my daughter was getting tired and she needed some space to play. The sheer poetry of that statement hit my mother like a physical blow. She had banned my child from this venue because she claimed Zuri was too wild and would ruin the pristine aesthetic of her high society illusion. Now I was turning a historical multi-million-dollar estate into a personal playground for my black daughter and kicking the so-called high society out into the cold night air to make room for her. That was the exact moment Preston lost what little remained of his sanity. The security guards had loosened their grip just enough to begin ushering him toward the grand oak doors, but he violently jerked his shoulder free. His custom tuxedo jacket ripped at the seam, the expensive fabric tearing with a loud, satisfying sound. He was sweating profusely, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at my face, his voice cracking as he screamed that he was going to sue me. He yelled that I was a thief and a corporate spy. He screamed that I had illegally hacked his private financial records, that I had defamed his character in front of the most powerful venture capitalists in the city, and that he was going to take me to court for every single penny I owned. He stood in the middle of my ballroom, completely bankrupt, living off my parents' stolen retirement funds, and actually had the audacity to threaten my empire. Preston yelled that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous woman who could not stand to see her sister happy. He claimed that I had orchestrated this entire night just because I was miserable and alone. He screamed that his lawyers would destroy me, that he would drag my private equity firm through the mud, and that by the time he was done with me, I would be the one begging for a bailout loan. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply watched him unravel, letting him exhaust himself against the impenetrable wall of my calm. I told Preston that in order to successfully sue someone for defamation, the statements made about him actually had to be false. I reminded him that projected bankruptcy filings and bank statements with zero balances were matters of public record if you knew exactly which federal databases to search. I told him that I did not have to steal anything, because incompetent men who run fraudulent hedge funds always leave a massive, sloppy paper trail. Preston took another aggressive step toward the stage, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He demanded that I hand over whatever fabricated evidence I claimed to have. He yelled that he was going to call the police and have me arrested for corporate espionage. He was clinging to the very last shreds of his unearned privilege, desperately believing that if he just yelled loud enough, if he just threatened legal action aggressively enough, the world would automatically side with him. He had severely underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. I did not build a reputation as a lethal acquisitions director by leaving loose ends. I raised my hand and signaled to David, my broker, who had been standing discreetly near the coat check all evening. David walked forward calmly, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room as the catering staff began rolling away the lavish dining tables around him. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He handed it up to me without a single word. I held the folder in my hands, feeling the weight of Preston's absolute destruction resting perfectly in my palms. I walked down the 3 short steps from the main stage, the silk of my gown gliding over the hardwood floor. The security guards instantly tensed, ready to intervene if Preston tried anything physical, but I waved them back. I walked right up to my brother-in-law. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting wildly between my face and the thick folder in my hands. I held the folder out to him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching it from my grasp, tearing the flap open with trembling fingers. He looked down at the stack of documents inside. I watched his eyes scan the first page, and I watched the last remaining drop of defiance completely drain from his body. His knees physically buckled, and he had to grab the edge of a bare cocktail table just to keep himself standing. I looked him dead in the eye, keeping my voice perfectly level, ensuring that every word cut through the air like glass. I told Preston that my corporate lawyers had already compiled his entire history of wire fraud, embezzlement, and predatory leveraging. I explained that we did not just find the money he stole from my parents, but we also found the phantom accounts he used to funnel investments from his previous clients. I stepped slightly closer to him, allowing the cold reality of his situation to fully sink in. I told him that my legal team had already forwarded his complete unredacted financial records directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I let that acronym hang in the air between us. The SEC, the federal government. This was no longer a petty family dispute over a birthday party venue. This was a massive federal crime, and he was the sole target of a highly coordinated investigation. I told Preston that he would be hearing from federal agents bright and early on Monday morning. I looked over at Chantel, who was still weeping on the floor, clutching her designer purse against her chest, as if the leather could somehow protect her from the catastrophic fallout. I turned my attention back to Preston, offering him one final devastating piece of advice. I suggested that he use whatever cash was left hiding in the bottom of Chantel's purse to hire a very good criminal defense attorney, because he was absolutely going to need one. Preston dropped the folder. The papers spilled out across the polished hardwood floor, scattering over my mother's rented silver shoes. He could not speak. He could not scream. The reality of federal prison had finally broken through his delusion. I signaled the security guards one last time, turned my back on my former family, and walked back to my daughter. I turned my back on the man who had spent the last 5 years treating me like a second-class citizen and walked toward my daughter. The heavy thud of the financial documents hitting the polished hardwood floor echoed behind me. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the synchronized heavy footsteps of my security team moving in to execute my final order. The guards did not ask Preston to leave. They simply flanked him, their massive frames casting long shadows over his trembling body. They gripped him by his upper arms and physically turned him toward the grand oak exit doors. Preston did not fight back this time. The threat of the federal government had completely paralyzed him. He walked like a dead man, his custom tuxedo torn at the shoulder, dragging his expensive leather loafers across the floor. My father, Jerome, followed right behind him, his shoulders slumped, his face buried in his hands. The man who had spent his entire life policing my tone and demanding my obedience was now broken by the very white son-in-law he had worshipped. My mother. Brenda walked blindly beside him, her rented silver gown shimmering under the chandeliers as she stared vacantly ahead, stripped of every single illusion she had ever projected. But just as the guards ushered Preston toward the heavy glass vestibule, a sudden piercing shriek ripped through the ballroom. I stopped and turned around. Chantel had broken away from the group. She shoved past my mother, nearly knocking Brenda off balance, and sprinted back across the empty dance floor. She was running so fast in her designer heels that she nearly twisted her ankle, her arms flailing wildly as she desperately closed the distance between us. The perfect, arrogant composure she had worn like armor her entire life had completely evaporated. Her makeup was streaked with dark, ugly tear stains. The flawless updo she had spent hours at the salon perfecting was falling apart, loose strands of hair sticking to her wet cheeks. Two of my security guards immediately stepped forward to intercept her, crossing their arms to form a human barricade between my sister and my daughter. Chantel slammed into them, clawing at their dark suits, sobbing hysterically as she tried to push her way through. "Jada, please!" She screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. "Jada, you have to listen to me. You have to tell them to let me go. I am not with him. I am not with Preston." I raised my right hand, signaling the guards to hold their position, but allowing her to speak. I looked down at the woman who had been the golden child of our family since the day she was born. Chantel had spent 35 years looking down her nose at me. She had actively participated in my emotional destruction, happily accepting our parents' lavish praise while watching them treat me like a burden. She had weaponized her proximity to Preston's supposed generational wealth to make me feel inadequate, mocking my status as a single black mother at every Sunday dinner. Now she was pressed against the chests of 2 security guards on my payroll, begging for my mercy. I did not know. Chantel sobbed, her hands shaking violently as she reached out toward me, desperate to grab the silk of my emerald gown. I swear to you, Jada, I had no idea how bad it was. Preston lied to me. He told me the venture capital fund was just experiencing a temporary liquidity issue. He told me the money he took from Mom and Dad was just a bridge loan. I am a victim here. You have to believe me. He manipulated me just like he manipulated them. I looked at her, my expression completely, entirely blank. I let her cry. I let her spin her desperate, pathetic web of lies in front of the venue staff, who were quietly watching from the perimeter of the room. Chantel wiped her nose with the back of her trembling hand, smearing her expensive foundation. "You have to let me come home with you tonight," she pleaded, her voice dropping into a frantic, begging whisper. "I cannot go back to that house with him. The bank is going to take it. The feds are going to raid it. I have absolutely no money, Jada. He drained my savings. I do not have a single dollar to my name. Please, we are sisters. You have that massive guest room. Just let me stay with you until I figure this out." The sheer audacity of her request was breathtaking. She had spent the entire week treating me like an incompetent servant, insulting my career, and demanding that I fund this fraudulent party to save her lifestyle. Now that the ship was actively sinking, she wanted to climb into my lifeboat and pretend we were family. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The security guard shifted slightly, giving me just enough space to look my sister directly in the eyes. "You are not a victim, Chantel," I said, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying an absolute, undeniable authority. "I stood on your front porch on Thursday afternoon. I heard you screaming at him in your foyer. I heard you explicitly acknowledge that he had embezzled Mom and Dad's entire retirement fund." Chantel physically recoiled, the breath hitching in her throat as her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. I watched the exact moment her brain processed the reality that I had known everything all along. I continued, driving the blade of truth even deeper. "You knew he robbed our parents blind, and your first instinct was not to warn them. Your first instinct was to walk out your front door, look me in the eye, and demand that I wire $25,000 to this venue so your husband could scam his way out of federal prison. You were entirely complicit. You were willing to let our parents lose their home and their life savings just so you could keep playing the wealthy elite wife at the country club." "I did not have a choice," Chantel cried out, shaking her head frantically. "He is my husband, Jada. I was trying to save my marriage." "You were trying to save your aesthetic," I corrected sharply, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers above us. "You traded your own family for the illusion of white wealth. You spent your entire life molding yourself to fit into his racist, condescending world. You stood by and smirked while he insulted my career. You stood by while he called me a ghetto liability. You happily participated in the narrative that I was the family failure while you were the ultimate success story." Chantel sobbed harder, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor, no longer caring about the dirt on her expensive rented gown. "Jada, please," she begged, staring up at me. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no regret, no sisterly obligation. I thought about my beautiful, brilliant daughter sitting at the VIP table just a few yards away. "You called my daughter a tornado," I said, my voice turning to pure ice. "You allowed our mother to ban a 5-year-old child from a family event because you claimed her joyful, vibrant energy would ruin your professional photography. You tried to erase my child to appease a room full of venture capitalists who just walked out on your husband in absolute disgust." I stepped back, creating a definitive physical boundary between us. "You built your entire life looking down on me, Chantel," I said firmly, delivering the final fatal blow to our relationship. "Now you can look up from the bottom." I did not wait for her response. I looked at the head of security. and gave him a single sharp nod. The guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Chantel by the arms and lifting her off the floor. She screamed my name, thrashing wildly against their grip as they turned her around and marched her toward the grand oak doors. Her cries echoed through the massive ballroom, growing fainter as they dragged her through the foyer and out into the night. I turned my back on the exit and walked straight to the VIP table where Zuri was sitting. She had finished her strawberries and was sleepily rubbing her eyes. I scooped her up into my arms, feeling the warm, solid reality of my daughter against my chest. She wrapped her little arms around my neck and rested her head on my shoulder. I held her tight, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my entire body. I walked slowly toward the towering glass windows that lined the front of the ballroom, looking out over the sprawling botanical gardens of my estate. Outside, the weather had finally broken. A sudden violent thunderstorm had rolled in off the coast. Torrential rain was falling in heavy gray sheets, illuminated by the bright security lights lining the gravel driveway. I stood by the glass and watched the final scene of their destruction play out. Preston was standing near the edge of the driveway, completely ignoring the rain soaking through his torn custom tuxedo. He was frantically pacing back and forth, screaming into his cell phone, desperately trying to reach a defense attorney who would answer a call at this hour from a man with frozen bank accounts. My parents were standing rigidly under the small awning of the valet station, waiting for a rideshare car because they could no longer afford the luxury black car service that had dropped them off. My father stared blankly into the rain, a broken, destitute man. My mother stood beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shivering in her rented silver gown. And then there was Chantel. The security guards had released her at the edge of the property line. She was left standing entirely alone on the wet concrete curb. Preston did not even look in her direction. My parents were too consumed by their own financial ruin to comfort her. The torrential rain beat down on her, relentlessly plastering her ruined hair to her face. She was weeping uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. The heavy, expensive fabric of her designer dress, the very dress she thought made her superior to me, was completely soaked through. The hem was dragging deeply in the mud and filthy puddle water collecting in the street. She looked absolutely pathetic. She looked exactly like a woman who had sold her soul for a life that never really existed. I watched her stand there in the freezing rain, entirely stripped of her golden child status, completely abandoned by the fraudulent man she had chosen over her own blood. I turned away from the window, pulling Zuri a little closer to my chest, and walked back into the warmth and light of my own empire. I watched Chantel collapse into the mud from the safety of the grand ballroom windows. I held my daughter tightly against my chest, ready to turn my back on the entire spectacle and walk back into the warmth of my estate. I had just taken my first step away from the glass when a sudden movement outside caught my attention. I stopped and looked back out into the torrential rain. My father was no longer standing under the small valet awning with my mother. He had broken away from her side. Jerome was walking slowly back up the long gravel driveway, completely ignoring the heavy sheets of freezing rain that were soaking his tailored suit. His head was bowed, his shoulders were violently shaking, and he looked like a man who had aged 2 decades in the span of 30 minutes. I gently set Zuri down on her feet. I signaled for one of the estate managers, a kind older woman who had been completely charmed by my daughter all evening. I asked her to take Zuri to the kitchen and see if the pastry chef had any extra chocolate strawberries. Zuri cheered happily, taking the manager's hand and skipping away, completely shielded from the ugly reality of the adults standing out in the storm. Once my child was safely out of earshot, I walked back through the grand foyer toward the heavy oak front doors. 2 of my security guards were stationed just inside the glass vestibule, watching my father drag his feet up the marble steps. The guards instantly shifted into a defensive stance as Jerome approached the threshold, raising their hands to block him from re-entering the building. I stepped into the vestibule. The cold night air immediately washed over my bare shoulders. I raised my hand and gave the guards a single nod, instructing them to stand down and give us 5 feet of space. I did not invite my father inside. I stood perfectly still on the dry side of the marble threshold, letting him stand outside in the pouring rain. Jerome looked up at me, His face was completely saturated water dripping from his nose and chin, mixing with the thick, heavy tears pouring out of his eyes. The arrogant, respectable church elder, who had spent my entire life policing my tone, was entirely gone. The man standing in front of me was totally broken, stripped of his country club prestige and his unearned patriarchal authority. He opened his mouth to speak, but a loud, wretched sob tore through his throat instead. He reached out with a trembling hand, grabbing the wet brass handle of the open door, as if he needed it just to keep himself standing upright. Jada. Jada, he choked out, his voice cracking painfully over the sound of the thunder. Jada, please. You have to listen to me. Give me 2 minutes. Just give your father 2 minutes. I looked at him with an expression of pure, unyielding stone. I did not speak. I simply waited. He took a ragged breath, the rain plastering his graying hair to his forehead. I am so sorry. He cried, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate, frantic rush. I am so unbelievably sorry, baby. I did not know. I swear to God above, I had no idea Preston was stealing from us. He showed me the financial portfolios. He showed me the projected returns. I thought he was securing our family legacy. I thought he was a financial genius. I trusted him. I let his words hang in the freezing air between us. I looked at the man who was supposed to be my protector, the man who was supposed to be the pillar of my life. You trusted him because he was white, Dad. I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the storm with absolute surgical precision. You handed a mediocre man with a fake smile the keys to your entire life, simply because you thought his skin color and his country club stories made him inherently smarter than your own flesh and blood. You gave him your life savings because he represented the proximity to white wealth you and Mom so desperately worshipped. Jerome flinched violently, closing his eyes as if my words had physically struck him. He shook his head, fresh tears mixing with the rain. No, Jada, that is not true. He pleaded, holding his hands up in a gesture of absolute defeat. I just wanted what was best for the family. I just wanted peace. You know how your mother is. You know how Brenda gets when she does not get her way. If I fought her on this, if I told her Preston was a bad investment, she would have made my life a living hell. I was just trying to keep the peace in our house. I took one step forward, closing the distance between us, until I was standing right at the edge of the rain. The anger that had been simmering in my veins for 33 years finally crystallized into pure, absolute clarity. Peace for who? I asked, my voice rising just enough to compete with the thunder. You did not keep the peace, Dad. You just made sure the war was fought entirely on my back. You traded my mental health, my dignity, and my peace of mind, just so you could avoid arguing with your wife. Jerome sobbed loudly, dropping his head into his hands. I was weak, he cried. I was a weak man and I failed you. I am your father and I failed to protect you. You did not just fail to protect me. I corrected him, refusing to let him soften the reality of his abuse. You actively participated in my destruction. When Preston called my daughter a tornado at Sunday dinner, you poured him a glass of scotch and nodded your head. When Mom banned your own granddaughter from this very building, you called me on the phone and told me to just be agreeable and write a $25,000 check. You sat at the head of the table for 3 decades and watched them slaughter my self-esteem for sport, and your silence was just as loud and just as violent as Brenda's insults. I am sorry, Jerome wailed, dropping to his knees on the wet marble steps. He knelt in the freezing puddles, completely surrendering whatever remaining pride he had left. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my emerald gown, soaking the expensive green silk with his wet, desperate hands. Please, Jada. Please forgive me. I am an old man. I have lost everything. I have lost my retirement. I have lost my home. I have lost my reputation in the church. I have absolutely nothing left. Please do not leave me out here. You are my daughter. You have to help me. I looked down at the man kneeling in the mud in the rain. I thought about the little girl who used to bring home straight A report cards, hoping her father would finally look at her with pride instead of annoyance. I thought about the young woman who worked 3 jobs to pay her way through a finance degree, while her father funded her sister's lavish lifestyle. I thought about the mother who had to hold her child close and promise her that she was loved because her grandfather was too busy playing golf with a racist fraud to bother showing up to her ballet recitals. The hardest truth to accept about an enabler is that they are not victims. They are co-conspirators who value their own comfort more than your survival. Jerome was not crying because he realized he had broken my heart. He was crying because he realized he was broke, and the daughter he threw to the wolves was the only one who had built a safe house. I reached down and firmly pried his wet, trembling fingers off the fabric of my gown. I stood up straight, looking down at him with an absolute terrifying calmness. I did not feel rage anymore. I did not feel sadness. I felt nothing but a profound, undeniable sense of freedom. "I am not your savior, Dad," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the grand vestibule. "You chose your team. You chose your legacy. You decided that my pain was the acceptable price of your comfort. You enabled my abusers every single day of my life, and now you are begging me to save you from the very monster you invited into our home." Jerome stared up at me, his eyes wide and panicked. The reality of his complete and total isolation was finally sinking in. He realized that I was not going to open the door. He realized that I was not going to write a check to stop the bank from foreclosing on his house. He realized that the black daughter he had minimized and marginalized was completely shutting him out in the cold. "Enjoy the bed you made, Dad," I said, delivering the final fatal blow to our relationship. "I hope the country club membership was worth it." I took a deliberate step backward into the warm golden light of my grand foyer. I did not wait for his response. I did not wait to hear him cry out my name again. I turned my back on my father, completely severing the toxic bond that had chained me to his cowardice for my entire life. I looked at the head of security, who was standing at strict attention just a few feet away. "Lock the doors," I commanded smoothly. The security guards stepped forward immediately. They grabbed the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors. I walked away, my emerald gown gliding silently across the polished hardwood floor. Behind me, I heard the heavy, definitive sound of the double doors swinging shut, cutting off the noise of the pouring rain and the desperate sobbing of the man on the steps. Then came the sharp, heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The storm was officially locked outside. The fraud, the golden child, the narcissist, and the enabler were completely shut out of my life, trapped in the wreckage of their own making. I walked toward the kitchen, following the sound of my daughter's bright, joyful laughter. I had an empire to run and a little girl to raise in a house where she would only ever know absolute peace. I walked back into the grand ballroom. The stifling, toxic energy of my mother's country club associates and Preston's fraudulent investors was completely gone. The catering staff had worked with military efficiency. The rented silver linens were stripped away. The towering, ostentatious floral arrangements my sister had demanded were cleared out. The room was vast, echoing, and finally breathing. I found Zuri sitting at the very center of the main VIP table. Thomas, the head venue manager, was standing beside her with a genuine warm smile. He had personally brought out a massive slice of rich, dark chocolate cake on a silver platter. Two other staff members were hovering nearby, bringing her fresh strawberries and treating my 5-year-old daughter with the absolute reverence and respect that my own blood relatives had constantly denied her. I pulled out a chair and sat next to my little girl. Zuri had chocolate frosting smeared across her cheek, swinging her legs happily beneath her emerald green dress. She looked up at me with bright, innocent eyes and asked if the mean people were gone. I grabbed a cloth napkin, gently wiped her face, and told her they were gone forever. There was no more yelling. There were no more conditions. The estate was completely silent, save for the soft clinking of Zuri's fork against the plate and the distant muffled sound of the heavy rain battering the reinforced glass windows. I sat there in the quiet aftermath of the storm, watching my daughter eat her cake in a multi-million-dollar mansion that I owned free and clear. I had successfully executed the most ruthless acquisition of my entire career, but the greatest asset I secured that night was my absolute peace of mind. 6 months passed. The transition from winter to the vibrant heat of summer brought a complete restructuring of my reality. I was sitting at the custom mahogany desk in my home office, reviewing the quarterly earnings report for my private equity firm. The Sterling estate had been completely rebranded and renovated under my ownership. We were booked solid for the next 2 years with high-end corporate retreats and luxury weddings. The hospitality group was thriving because I actually paid my staff what they were worth and treated them like human beings instead of disposable props. While my empire expanded the illusion, my former family had desperately clung to, completely disintegrated. Preston did not just lose his venture capital firm, he lost his freedom. The federal agents had knocked on his door that very Monday morning exactly as I had promised. The sheer volume of his wire fraud and embezzlement was so extensive that the Securities and Exchange Commission handed him straight over to the Department of Justice. He was currently sitting under federal indictment, facing up to 20 years in prison. His wealthy white family, terrified of the public scandal, completely cut him off, refusing to pay a single dime toward his criminal defense attorneys. Chantel had to sell every single rented diamond designer handbag and luxury vehicle just to keep him out of pretrial detention. When the money completely dried up, the bank foreclosed on their massive suburban mansion. Chantel had no choice but to pack her remaining clothes in black garbage bags and move back into my parents' basement. But the basement was not the sanctuary she expected, because my parents were fighting their own brutal battle for survival. Since Preston had completely drained their retirement accounts to fund his Ponzi scheme, my father Jerome had to come out of his early retirement. The man who had spent my entire life lecturing me about respectability politics and country club prestige was now forced to work as a minimum wage greeter at the exact same golf club where he used to be a premium member. When his former golf buddies arrived at the club in their luxury vehicles, Jerome had to force a smile open their doors and unload their heavy golf bags. He had to accept their wrinkled dollar bills as tips, swallowing his massive pride while they looked at him with awkward, unfiltered pity. My mother Brenda, stripped of her social standing and her financial safety net, rarely left the house. Her entire identity had been wrapped up in portraying a flawless, wealthy aesthetic. Without her money and her status, she was completely hollow. Chantel could no longer afford her expensive highlights or the designer clothes she used to weaponize against me. The high society friends she had desperately tried to impress completely abandoned her the moment Preston's indictment made the local news. She was forced to sit in that damp, cramped basement staring at the remnants of a life built entirely on lies. They tried to call me. They tried to call me every single day. My phone would light up with notifications from Jerome, Brenda, and Chantel. The voicemails were a pathetic, predictable cycle of manipulation. Some days they begged for a bailout, crying that they could not afford the mortgage payments on my childhood home. Other days they tried to guilt-trip me, claiming that family is supposed to stick together through hard times, conveniently forgetting that they had planned to let me fund a criminal enterprise while treating my child like a nuisance. I sat at my desk and listened to one final voicemail from Chantel. Her voice was thin and ragged, pleading with me to just wire them $10,000 to keep the electricity turned on. She promised she had changed. She swore they all realized how terribly they had treated me. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering guilt. There was no residual anger. There was just a flat, neutral void where my attachment to them used to be. I tapped the screen of my phone, selected each of their contacts one by one, and hit block. I erased them from my digital life just as thoroughly as I had erased them from my physical world. I set my phone face down on the desk, stood up, and walked out of my office. I stepped out onto the expansive stone patio of the estate. The summer sun was shining brightly over the rolling green lawns and blooming botanical gardens. The air was warm and sweet. Out on the main lawn, Suri was running completely wild. She was not wearing a stiff, uncomfortable dress meant to satisfy someone else's visual standards. She was wearing bright pink overalls and neon sneakers. She was chasing a brilliant yellow butterfly across the grass, laughing at the absolute top of her lungs. Her beautiful natural hair bounced freely with every step. She was loud, she was vibrant, and she took up as much space as she wanted. A professional photographer, a black woman I had specifically hired for our summer portraits, was tracking Zuri with her camera. The photographer did not ask my daughter to quiet down. She did not ask her to stand still or pose like a mannequin. She simply laughed along with Zuri, snapping photos of her pure, unfiltered joy. I walked down the stone steps and stepped onto the warm grass. Zuri saw me let out a massive squeal of delight and sprinted full speed into my arms. I caught her, spinning her around in the sunlight as she wrapped her arms tightly around my neck. The photographer raised her camera and captured the moment. The flash went off, freezing us in time. We were not quiet. We were not catering to a fragile, toxic aesthetic. We were loud, we were vibrant, and we were beautifully, wonderfully imperfect. I looked at my daughter, knowing that the generational curse of conditional love had been permanently broken. I had built my own table, secured my own crown, and created a kingdom where my child would always be unconditionally celebrated. It was the absolute perfect picture. Family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes the people supposed to protect you become your greatest threat. True power comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to shrink yourself to fit a toxic narrative. Jada's journey proves that cutting ties with manipulative relatives is never a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and strength. You must build your own table instead of begging for a seat. Have you ever walked away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your true story below. Please like and subscribe for more empowering tales of taking back your power.